Good morning, everyone. I'm here this morning to talk to you again about the urban mobility strategy, urban mobility and transportation strategy that we've been working with our consultant on for the last couple of years. We now have the final report from STEER. It is very close to completion with just some I's to dot and T's to cross. And you may recall that I presented both to yourselves and to council near the end of 2020 to first introduce the strategy and second to highlight some additional work that STEER had done for us regarding the impacts of COVID-19 on Oakville's transportation. Even though I won't be speaking again this morning to that component, STEER's piece on COVID does form part of this final strategy document. What I'm going to do is focus on all the other great stuff that you can find in this strategy. But before I do that, I will point out that our intent is to present this final strategy to council at the Planning and Development meeting on February 14, with your endorsement to do so, of course. To start, I think it's important to provide some perspective by showing how this is not a standalone initiative, but is actually a key piece of guiding Oakville into the future, in alignment with many of our other initiatives that we already have going on. So this is a slide that I've used a number of times, so maybe you remember it from before. I use this slide to show that the province has a growth plan that directs municipalities to plan to accommodate future anticipated growth going forward. The growth plan specifies the number of people and jobs that Halton Region, for example, needs to plan to accommodate. And then Halton, through its Integrated Growth Management Strategy, or IGMS, is figuring out how to distribute that to all of us locals here within Halton. And that's what the preferred growth concept that you may have heard about is all about. So this is really Halton's growth management strategy. And Oakville has its own growth management strategy too. You may have heard about this one. It's called our townwide urban structure. And at its heart, our urban structure it's quite straightforward, I think. It's a system of growth nodes and corridors to create walkable, complete communities supported by higher order transit corridors. It's to this system of nodes and corridors that we want to direct the majority of our future growth in Oakville. I really like this graphic that I borrowed from the region because it quickly shows the built form of these nodes and corridors in a conceptual way. But our urban structure is not just about how we build places to live and work. It is also about how we move people in and through this type of environment. And that's where the urban mobility and transportation strategy becomes a vital part of making sure our urban structure is successful. And here's some more really important context, the climate change angle. As you know, Council has declared a climate change emergency, that we need to look for ways to reduce our impact on climate change. So let me be clear here that choices the town makes with respect to mobility will have significant implications on how effective we actually will be at doing this. So if you take a look at the town's community energy strategy, you'll find this little nugget. Transportation accounts for almost half of community-wide greenhouse gas emissions and total dollars spent on energy in Oakville. And over 70% of transportation activity is person vehicle use. You'll also find this stat. Oakville's homes alone contribute 27% of the community's greenhouse gas emissions. What this means is that driving our cars and heating and cooling our homes, these two things represent 77% of Oakville's greenhouse gas emissions. These two areas should be where we are directing most of our efforts in order to combat climate change. However, as STEER points out in the strategy, this won't necessarily be easy based on how Oakville has developed in the past. But now is the time to make some changes. The strategy states that the town of Oakville has long developed around the private automobile. Its urban form, and therefore the mode of choice of its residents, reflects that. So in case you missed that nuance, this is saying that our urban form is directly linked to the mode of choice of our residents, which currently is the automobile. So if we continue with the status quo of how we've developed our built form, it will be very hard to change that mode of choice for our residents. STEER does emphasize that now Oakville is at a turning point in its development. And I think this may be their way of saying it's not too late yet. I think the tendency is and has been to frame the question of transportation for Oakville this way. And I'm borrowing this question from a webinar I recently attended. How can we make car dependency work? Stating the problem this way is essentially acknowledging that with more and more people coming to Oakville, we're going to get congestion. And then what can we do to relieve congestion so that we can all still go around driving around in cars? In the webinar, the presenter equated this question to asking the question, how can we make cigarette smoking safe? I think it's generally accepted these days that we simply can't make smoking safe. And I would argue the same goes for this question of car dependency. We simply can't make car dependency work going forward. I think we need to reframe the question to something more like this. How can we make transport more sustainable, more healthful, more affordable, less exclusive, and less necessary? And as an urban planner, while I love all of these things, I really love the last part. How do we make transport less necessary? That's the part that relates to urban form. STEER also provides a stark warning for Oakville. If things do not change, the town will not be able to accommodate the demands of the future that come from existing within a growing region. So I think this is flat out saying that we won't be able to make car dependency work in the future as we grow. Nor will Oakville be able to adapt to an evolving transportation landscape. So think connected and automated vehicles, electric vehicles, advances in micromobility, emphasis on transit and higher order transit, active transportation, and so on. Nor will it be able to respond to a changing climate. And I think this is pretty clear that if we continue with how we've grown and developed in the past as a car dependent community, and we don't change and adapt, we simply won't be able to respond in a meaningful way to climate change. And I think that's a key observation we should not take lightly. Now, this may paint a dire picture of where Oakville currently is, but there is some good news. Oakville has already been trying to change things. And I think council's endorsement of 7 key transit priorities back in December at Barry Cole's farewell appearance at Planning and Development Council is prime evidence that we're trying to change things. And in fact, these transit priorities mesh very well with the recommendations coming out of the urban mobility strategy. I really like what Barry said about trying to move more people in less vehicles, and that's key. And maybe you've seen images before like this one that try to show what other modes of transportation can offer in terms of requiring less space on our streets in order to transport an equivalent number of people. Or maybe this one, which I've shown to you before, which shows how many people can move through the same 3-meter wide street space at peak conditions. So, as is evident from these images and statistics, private automobiles, which is Oakville's current transport mode of choice, are actually the least space efficient form of moving people, with transit and active transportation being way more efficient. Yet, we have traditionally prioritized private motor vehicles in our urban form and our transportation network design. So then I ask the question, what happens if we start to prioritize or focus on the forms of transit that are more efficient at moving people and goods? Well, then this essentially flips our prioritization on its head. So now we'll see pedestrians, cyclists, and transit riders at the top. They become the most important users of our transportation system. This is then followed by people doing business and providing services or goods movement. People moving in private motorized vehicles are not eliminated from the mix. Their priority as a mode of travel, however, is a lot less. And I think it's important to point out here that this category of private automobiles would also include electric vehicles. They still take up valuable space in our right-of-ways. They still require a hefty amount of energy to move. It's just that their main benefit is that they don't happen to emit greenhouse gas emissions out of their tailpipe. And so just to stay on this point for a little bit longer, because I think there's a potential misconception that simply switching to electric power will save us from climate change, but that isn't the case. And I'll share this tweet that I came across the other day. It happens to be in French, but it says, essentially, decarbonizing transport is not just about switching to an electric motor. It also means using, when possible, public transport or cycling. And at its heart, that's what the urban mobility and transportation strategy is all about. Cars will always be a part of Oakville, but now we need to really focus on providing a whole gamut of viable and practical other choices to move around in Oakville, other than the automobile. STEER advises that what is key to making our urban structure successful is then linking transportation and land use planning. Complete community high density growth nodes, like the ones we've identified in our urban structure, will ultimately only work if there are lots of viable choices for moving people around, not just one. Just creating high density nodes where everyone still drives is not going to work. And with respect to this, STEER again warns that Oakville's land use and transportation objectives, essentially what we talk about in our master plans and official plans, are not yet in full alignment with Oakville's land use and transportation context, essentially what exists currently on the ground. Transportation and land use policies form a feedback loop with each other. Oakville is at a point where we can either move to create a positive feedback relationship between these, if we align these policies correctly, or we can dive into a spiraling vicious cycle that is hard to get out of if we continued not to be aligned, or if we continue with the status quo, for example. So let me read you the example of this relationship that STEER gives in the strategy. A neighborhood of single-family homes creates a wide variety of trips to work, to school, for recreation, or for shopping. However, single-use zoning, which I will add is prevalent here in Oakville, necessitates a network of wide roads connecting districts of the town together, as the different uses are not located in close enough proximity to walk or cycle, for example. And the creation of these roads makes more and more of the town then accessible by car, which then again encourages more of this type of development, but at the same time discourages other modes of travel because now these things are overly spread out. And the result is that a vicious cycle has been created in which the entire town is designed around the car at the expense of all other transportation options. So this is why STEER stresses the linking of transportation and land use. First, in order to shift people towards alternative mobility modes, Oakville needs to prioritize these modes. Otherwise, the status quo of auto dependency will continue. Oakville now needs to almost overemphasize all of the alternatives just to make these as viable or even more viable than automobiles. The key role of our transportation network needs to be about moving people, not about moving cars, or as Gabe would say, building car sewers. So this leads to the importance of complete streets, building a network to accommodate as many travel modes as possible, emphasizing transit and active transportation. And then second, Oakville needs to develop a human scale urban form for that mobility to thrive in. STEER argues that Oakville is currently too spread out for more sustainable modes to be truly viable as an alternative. Most of our land uses are all spread too far apart from each other. And what's more, our minimum parking requirements result in many of those destinations being separated even more by large, often empty parking lots that really spread these things apart. So this is why STEER recommends that Oakville concentrate on building complete 15-minute neighborhoods that contain a mix of land uses that can accommodate the day-to-day needs of its residents so that they no longer need to hop in a car for every little thing in a day. What I really find interesting about where STEER has landed with these two directions is that they also align with what the Oakville's community energy strategy has identified as the two largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in Oakville, our cars and our homes, if you remember the 77% stat from earlier. So if we focus on where STEER is recommending to go, we will also directly address the climate emergency. And then lastly, STEER also suggests that travel demand management, which STEER uses as a bucket to contain a lot of additional concepts, strategies, and technologies, will also form an important part of this picture as well. STEER acknowledges that there will be challenges to doing this because there are things that are outside of Oakville's control, as we all know. So think about market forces. There are developers who may not always agree with us on what should be built in Oakville. So STEER suggests that perhaps economic incentives may be needed to offset those contrary influences within the market. And then of course, regional roads. Need I say more? Think about Trafalgar and Dundas, not owned by the town. It gets really tough when Oakville and Halton's visions for these roads diverge. But these spines are critical to Oakville's future development and to our urban structure. So it's crucial that Oakville do everything that it can to get Halton Region's support for a common vision for these corridors to reach their full potential. Because without this, the strategy, and even I would argue our urban structure, will not be successful. So the urban mobility strategy is really a large toolbox, a large collection of tools for Oakville to use, combined with a list of actions for how these tools can be used to achieve the desired link between mobility and land use. So there are a lot of tools, and I'm not going to talk in depth about each one of them, but I do want to give you a sense of the breadth of the tools that STEER has collected for us. So let's open it up and take a peek. With respect to complete streets, the strategy discusses auto elements and makes the case that it is actually okay to shift priority away from the auto-focused paradigm that has dominated Oakville for so long, and how to do so. It talks about pedestrian elements and outlines street improvements to improve the pedestrian environment, and then suggests metrics to measure how well those improvements are functioning. Cycling elements, again, similar, outlines improvements to the cycling environment and metrics to improve those improvements. And an example is including the introduction of a bike share service. Transit elements, here it explores how to improve transit service through both street and operational improvements, and how to build the case for future BRT or bus rapid transit service on Dundas and Trafalgar. You know, those important roads that we don't own, but they are crucial. And I think Barry Cole's presentation, again, highlighted the need to really build the case for future BRT on these right-of-ways. Parking. Here it critically examines how Oakville deals with its parking supply and provides suggestions on how the supply can be right-sized to be used more efficiently in the future. Freight and goods movement. This part highlights that congestion from private vehicles slows down goods movement. And while it's more difficult to shift the transport of goods to alternative transport modes, there are actions that Oakville can focus on to help make goods movement more efficient and more effective. Flipping to the other side, with respect to 15-minute neighborhoods, STEER's strategy breaks things down into 6 parts. First, it discusses what the components are that make up a 15-minute neighborhood. Then the strategy discusses what it would take to implement these complete walkable communities. The strategy certainly acknowledges and identifies that our current urban structure is already based on a system of key nodes and corridors, and that what we call our strategic growth areas are already planned to develop as 15-minute neighborhoods. And some of these nodes will be created from scratch, like Midtown, Bronte Go, or the Hospital District. But there are others in the process of being that are already in the process of being created, like Uptown and Palermo Village. And yet there are even other nodes that can be further built upon. For the nodes from scratch, STEER reinforces focusing on where the buildings meet the street, the urban design of the built form, and creating main streets as key to good 15-minute neighborhoods. And it also discourages the idea of districting, because that can lead to that single-use zoning that we talked about earlier. For our existing nodes, the way to build on them is to preserve that main street that we already have in a lot of our main street areas, and advocate for gentle growth, gentle intensification, and strengthen the connections to and from these areas. That's key. It's not just about building them in isolation. They need to be part of an overall network. STEER then goes on to suggest that we look beyond the key nodes that we've already identified within our urban structure and think about how we can actually retrofit our established neighborhoods to become more like 15-minute neighborhoods. This is certainly a more challenging to do, but should be an important part of Oakville's long-term strategy. Lastly, STEER discusses traffic demand management, or TDM. And as I mentioned earlier, TDM is a broad subject matter that encompasses a lot of different concepts, strategies, and even technology. And some parts of TDM, such as improving the viability of alternative modes of travel, have already been covered in the sections I just went through. And then STEER uses a TDM section of the strategy to discuss some of the some of the areas that have not already been covered. So these are things like social programs, which are easily implemented initiatives to encourage the use of alternatives to the car. And you can see a list of them here. STEER also talks about mobility as a service. And this is the concept of people traveling using services provided by others rather than vehicles that they privately own. And STEER addresses the opportunities and potential pitfalls that new technologies can and will bring us. So alternative energy sources are certainly an emerging technology, particularly electric vehicles of all forms, cars, trucks, bicycles, and buses. But while electric cars and trucks may reduce our greenhouse gas emissions directly from vehicles, they do not really address the issue of congestion. Electric bikes and buses, on the other hand, certainly offer opportunities to address both greenhouse gas emissions and congestion. Autonomous vehicles is a topic that certainly merits consideration, but STEER warns that there are both pros and cons to this technology that Oakville needs to consider and begin to outline some of those in the strategy. And then lastly, data. Data is a huge factor in all of these new technologies. And STEER particularly emphasizes the need for more open data, particularly open live data for real-time information that will enable all of these technologies to function effectively. So at this point, some of you may be thinking, well, where does this urban mobility strategy fit within the grand scheme of all of our existing policies and master plans? Well, and the main role of the urban mobility strategy is to bridge the gap between past studies and future work. As STEER says, Oakville is at a turning point, and this strategy attempts to facilitate a turn in the correct direction. So as the strategy says, and I'm quoting here again, Oakville is not starting from zero. The town has already advanced in its pursuit of unified land use and transportation policies in recent years, with 8 growth nodes and 2 growth corridors identified in its urban structure and official plan, and a considerable amount of planning work completed to guide their intensification. In time, this effort will start to pay off. The urban mobility and transportation strategy simply builds upon the examples Oakville has already put forward, and it presents a high-level strategy for unifying land use and transportation policies at the municipal level to support Oakville's vision for a better tomorrow at current growth nodes, future ones, and everything in between. So what you can see here in gray are all the various studies and initiatives that the urban mobility strategy can be a key part of starting or being a starting point for. So where do we go from here? First, as mentioned before, we want to present the strategy to council in February. I think we should stress that this strategy is an important part of implementing our townwide urban structure already approved by council and is a key to its success. As the strategy recommends, we need to take action on better linking, even more than we already have, our transportation policies and our land use policies. And think, what a better opportunity to do that than in the upcoming transportation master plan work that we'll be beginning this year. And finally, it's important to acknowledge that a funding strategy for the strategy's recommendations was outside of the scope for STEER's work. So we will need to make key budget decisions in order to implement the recommendations, particularly adjusting to new priorities of pedestrians, cyclists, transit, goods movement before personal automobiles. And while the strategy does suggest a number of potential quick wins that on the surface appear easy enough to implement, such as upgrading protected bike lanes, painting bike boxes, narrowing lanes, reducing speed limits, rumble strips, winter maintenance for bike lanes and bike facilities, signage, stencils, pavement markings for safe routes to school, and others, these all require funding. First, to implement, so capital funding for design and planning, which lies within the realm of engineering and construction. And then the next part, just as important, is how to maintain these features going forward. And of course, this lies with roads and works. So they need to be tied in, and operational budgets are a key factor of this. So it's vital that Roads and Works has the operating funds and the crews to maintain these great features if they are going to continue to be effective in the long term. So yes, we have a lot of work to do, but I think it's exciting. And I really feel this strategy helps to unify our vision of what we are trying to achieve in Oakville going forward. Thank you.